Okay, so you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, did I already watch this lecture? That's understandable given what you see in the slide before you. However, this is not the same lecture that you might have had in a previous unit. All right, so what we're going to be focusing on in this lecture that is different from the other lecture is the concept of an intellectual virtue known as intellectual empathy, and the one known as intellectual perseverance. Hi there, and welcome to a new lecture on intellectual virtue. As you can see from the title of this slide, I'm going to be focusing on intellectual empathy in this video. Before we do that, let's go ahead and do an important review. I'm doing this because I noticed in a previous test that students were struggling with some concepts and some test items, so that showed to me that students still need help understanding some concepts relevant to and undergirding the concept of intellectual virtue that we'll be focusing on. So let's begin with the general definition of intellectual virtue. So I'm not focusing on intellectual empathy directly in particular, but what is true of any intellectual virtue. So remember that intellectual virtue, that there is a definition that I told you that I want you to remember. Okay, so most of you do pretty well with this one. So remember, an intellectual virtue or intellectual virtue itself is constituted by character traits of good thinkers and good learners. So character traits, good thinkers, learners. If I repeat good to say character traits, good thinkers, good learners, then I have 6 terms in there that are key. So remember, that is the definition that I want you to use, either with 2 usages of the word good or just one. You'll get a correct result in any case. So the other thing that I want you to remember is something that I've talked about before, but that I want to stress again because it will definitely be important to following what I have to say about intellectual empathy. And that is that you need to remember that a virtue is a perfection. It is an aspiration. It's something that we aspire to, what some people would call an excellence of human functioning, of human reason. And the thing is that even though it might be considered a kind of excellence, something that we should aspire to, you shouldn't feel bad or think negatively of yourself or others who are not perfect when it comes to how one should think or feel or behave in a certain context or whatnot. But virtues are seen to be positive things, generally speaking, whether they're moral or intellectual. They are perfections or excellences. They are things that we strive towards being. That is, that said, because we are human beings, we're limited and we're prone to make mistakes and err. And sometimes we're just not feeling like being very virtuous, right? Or we forget to be, or we're just not in a position to really push ourselves to be virtuous. But the overall idea is that virtues are good things. They are things that we aspire to. They are considered excellences or perfections, but they are things that we aspire to. I don't think that we can ever 100%, 100% master a given virtue. The other thing you have to remember is that for each virtue, there are 2 opposites. Okay, so opposites, key word in there. These opposites can be called extremes. All right, so when it comes to having too little of a given virtue, that is what is called an extreme of deficiency, a deficit. Okay, and again, that's when you have too little of something. That is called also a vice. So when it comes to virtue, you can have too little of that, which makes you reflect that kind of virtue, meaning you're falling short. You have too little of that, which makes you otherwise, virtuous. You're reflecting a deficiency. You're reflecting a vice. Now, when it comes to the other opposite or the other extreme, we are then talking, of course, about another vice. And so when you have too much of something that makes you otherwise virtuous, then you are going beyond. Aristotle would say you're making a mistake. And by the way, a lot of what I'm saying is directly informed by Aristotle, one of our ancient Greek philosophers. So that's where you'll see a little bit of my own opinion. And what I care about is that I'm very much into character and intellectual virtue. I care about moral virtues, but I also like to emphasize intellectual virtues because I think it can help you as a student, as a thinker, as a learner, but also as a human being. So anyway, as I was saying, The opposite, another opposite, or a second opposite, or another opposite to consider in terms of being virtuous is that of an extreme of excess. That's when you have too much of something that would make you virtuous in some particular way. So that's going beyond and making mistake. So that is something to consider. Okay, so you have virtues, and you can consider those as a balance between two extremes. Virtues are perfections, things that we want, things that we aspire to, things that we try to reflect and manifest in our everyday lives, in our academic lives, even though we may not completely master a given virtue. For each virtue, there's two opposites. The two opposites are also called extremes, otherwise known as a vice. So every virtue has a set of vices, a set of extremes, a set of opposites. When you have too little of something, that's called a deficit. You're falling short. When you have too much of something that makes you otherwise virtuous, that's called an excess. You're going beyond. Okay, so remember that throughout the semester. All right, so now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and go into intellectual empathy, but I think I'm going to create a separate video because students tend to like videos chunked.